So now I want to introduce to you the topic of scope. And when we're working with variables, scope is fairly important because you're going to need to know what is going to happen with a variable. When you try to grab the value of a variable or assign a value to a variable, scope is really going to influence what happens. And really what scope is just it's this concept that variables can exist in different contexts. And what I mean by context is that within your code, there's going to be certain sections of the code that are basically a context in which that variable has a meaning or a different meaning or no meaning at all. And if you look at this diagram that I have here, this kind of represents some code. If you look at the green box, that green box might be a class. And we haven't covered class yet, but class is the basic thing that all things in Java must be contained within a class, all of your code. It's a big container. It represents an object in the world. We'll cover this more when we talk about classes. But within that class, you may have some variables that are declared at the class scope. And then within that class, you might have a method, and a method is just a set of instructions that are grouped by a name. And you may have some variables that are declared within that method, and then within that method, you may have some variables that are declared within certain blocks or certain sections of code within that method. So really what you're seeing here is that these variables have a different scope based on where they are declared. And one of the things with scope is that always variables that are from an outer scope are visible within inner scopes, but variables from inner scopes are not visible in the outer scopes. So let me break that down this is the key concept. We don't even really have to go much into depth here. If you understand this, you'll understand how scoping works and all the rules. We don't have to go over each individual rule. But this is the basic premise. If I declare something at the class level scope, that's an outer scope. It's the outside, it's less specific. As we go into the method, the method is inside the class, and maybe the block or the statement are inside the method. So that's the outermost is the class, and then within that is a method, and within that is maybe a block or a set of statements. So from the outside, if you declared a variable all the way up at the top, the class level, inside your method, you'd be able to see that variable. It would exist. You could manipulate it. Inside the block or inside a block of statements inside that method, you would also be able to see that variable. Now, by contrast, if we had declared a variable inside in the innermost block, inside a method, inside a class, if we declare a variable all the way deep inside, you can't see it from the outside. The class isn't going to be able to access it. So that's the idea of scoping, is that variables go out of scope when their block or their section ends, where they're declared. That basic concept or that construct that where they are declared is where they live and they exist, and outside of that they don't. And so since you see that in this diagram, I'm showing that a class has a method which has statements or blocks, the variables from the class exist all the way down that chain. But if you declared a variable inside of a block, inside of a method, it doesn't exist outside of that. So that's the whole concept of scope, and we'll look at some examples